In the memory of the older generation who live in the former Yugoslav republics, part of their nostalgia is binging to the Mexican films and songs. In an article from 2016, a Mexican singer, Marina de Ita, traveled around the Balkans, taking advantage of her touring gig in Turkey, in Mardin, Turkey. During his busking gig in Belgrade in 2015, she sang some of the gypsy songs which thought to be suited for the Balkan people, but very few did care. To relieve herself, she sang a timeless Mexican song, Bésame Mucho, to entertain herself. And what surprised her is there is a small crowd gathered in front, and there was an old man shed his tears when he's listening to the song. So what happened here? In the socialist Yugoslavia between 1950 until the late 1970s and 1980s, Mexican culture is really dominant in the Western Balkan, in an atmosphere where Yugoslavia was trapped between the strained relation with the Soviet Union and the anti-capitalist stance against the United States. How did a culture separated by Atlantic Ocean with little in common in language, in history, and in geography could flourish in the Western Balkan? To understand why Mexican films win the hearts of the Yugoslavian, we need to learn who win the power struggle right after in the beginning of the Cold War. In the year 1945, after the end of World War II, socialist movement gained control of Yugoslavia after defeating the Nazi Germany who colonized the country. Under the leadership of Joseph Broz Tito, the socialist movement seemed triumphant over the Yugoslavia, and Tito envisioned Yugoslavia to include Bulgaria and Albania as part of his newly formed Federation of Yugoslavia with the support of Joseph Stalin, the leader of USSR. Making story short, actually it's a long story, making story short, the Bled Agreement was signed in 1947 in Bled between Yugoslavia and Bulgaria as the beginning of the unification process. But Bulgaria and Albania eventually refused to become part of the Yugoslavia due to their reduced status as just a Soviet republic with Tito in full power, which means that Bulgaria and Albania is just as a member like Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnian Republic and Slovenia in the federation. Just Bulgaria and Albania want to go out. And just about a year later, in June 1948, Bled Agreement was terminated by Tito, and the relation between Yugoslavia and USSR and also with Stalin soured. As a result, Yugoslavia refused to import any films and vinyl from USSR. Since Yugoslavia also has an anti-capitalist stance, they didn't import films from Hollywood either. So why Mexican films from all other countries that in the world except with India in Bollywood, but the Bollywood impact of the Bollywood films not so much with the Mexican films. The reason why Mexican films were in favor amongst all other films in the rest of the third world is that Mexican films shows a revolutionary message within a normal life. Maybe like people like doing everyday lives, working and going to the towns. Whereas there are some revolutionary message there, which often tell the story of the struggling Mexican fighting the Spanish colonizers and later the monarchy in the 19th and early 20th century, and also some imperialism within the Mexico, while living under the shadow of the United States, which already took away some of the historical Mexican land in the 19th century, such as the rest of California and also the state of Texas. It is just a happy coincidence that the values of the Mexicans share with the Yugoslavian in the 50s and 60s, who live under the shadow of the USSR and also its satellite states of the Eastern European in the 50th and the 60th century. And another reason, perhaps Mexican films were cheap to import compared with the Bollywood films, which is high demand in both USSR and also in the capitalist countries. And due to the restrained relation of the USSR, export from Yugoslavia and military aid and also other forms of redevelopment after the war to Yugoslavia were limited, means Yugoslavia has a tighter state budget, since the cost is also a big consideration. One of the earliest and most iconic films, Mexican films ever shown in Yugoslavia is a film from Emilio de Indio Fernandez titled Un Día de Vida, produced in the year 1950. Un Día de Vida in Spanish simply means the day in the life. It is a film about a Cuban journalist who traveled to Mexico during its revolutionary years in the early 20th century, which ended tragically as the protagonist witnessed the death sentence of a revolutionary on the hand of his childhood friend, which they always celebrated the revolutionary's mother's birthday altogether. The film Un Día de Vida is actually relatively less known in his home country, Mexico. The film doesn't even have its own Wikipedia pages at all, even in Spanish. But for the viewers in Yugoslavia in 1950, Un Día de Vida is not just a film, it is the film. The revolutionary message, the friendship, the hospitality of the people to the strangers, the Cubans, and most importantly, Las Mañanitas, a common birthday song actually in Latin America. In Yugoslavia, it's better known as Mama Juanita, one of the words in the lyrics. Watching Mexican films doesn't mean that Yugoslavian will eventually wear sombrero and form their own mariachi band. Or is it? With the explosive popularity of Mexican films in the Yugoslavia during the Cold War, the popularity of Mexican film caused the emergence of homegrown mariachi bands in the Balkan, singing about the place they never visited in a country they never went, singing about Guadalajara in the state of Jalisco. Some of the places in Yugoslavia, such as Deliplatska Peščara, also known as European Sahara, I hope I pronounced this name right. Some of the places in Yugoslavia, such as Deliplatska Peščara, also known as European Sahara in Vojvodina, northern Serbia today, has quite a similar landscape with the northern Mexican grassland where the gauchos live, making copycat Mexican films and Mexican-like album covers possible. In order to understand why Yugoslavian can accept Mexican films and later Mexican culture, whereas the Mexican culture is not really a global dominant culture at all in the 50s and 60s. In the international studies, there is a concept called soft power, which a country projected its mightiness in the form of economic or cultural dominance, which is the polar opposite of hard power that most people associate power from, which is the idea of military numbers, the number of soldiers, the number of missiles installed, the resources the country have and alliances. Okay, that is a hard power. Soft power instead, conquering heart and mind instead of the physical being. An expert of so-called Yu-Mex culture or Yugoslavian Mexican culture, the writer and director from Slovenia, Miha Mazini, he wrote a novel about the Yu-Mex culture, Paloma Negra, back in 2012, and also he mentioned that there was a distant possibility if Mexican tanks sat on the Yugoslavian border and Mexican films were revolutionary in nature, which that is the reason why Mexican films were chosen to be shown in Yugoslavia. The prospect of Mexican hard power against Yugoslavia is far from any realization, since both countries are separated by a mighty big Atlantic Ocean. Meanwhile, back in the Mexican. Meanwhile, back to American continent, actually Mexican didn't know much about the Mexican films nostalgia in Yugoslavia. Mexican didn't even remember the film Un Día de Vida, as actually the film failed catastrophically. Nobody wants to watch it, and the original copy of the film already lost in a fire. But in the other hand, Mexican entertainment industry is dominant in Spanish-speaking Latin American as a dominant regional soft power of its own. Maybe you heard of telenovela, for example, Maria Mercedes and also Rosalinda. Yeah, you got the idea. Might come to an end. But of course, the good times might come to an end. The death of Joseph Broz Tito in 1980 marked a unique event where more than 130 countries sent their leaders and dignitaries, where both sides of the Cold War, America and also Soviet Union, met in a state funeral, where later been developed in the international relations, also known as a funeral diplomacy, where people are meeting in the funeral. And thus, Yugoslavia later opened up to the wider world and new types of music flooded in. Youngsters more interested in pop and rock imported from the West, and not forgetting the popular German discotheque songs that passed through the 80s. As a result, Mexican songs were relegated as part of a distant past, or Yugo nostalgia, cultural symbol of a time where Yugoslavians sang about the place they never went, romanticizing a country that they never visit. Today, the legacy of Yu-Mex music is a unique legacy of how soft power could conquer hearts and minds of the population of non-aligned Yugoslavia, in a time where culture of the superpowers of America and Soviet Union were not a viable option. In a time where culture of the superpowers was not a viable option, the absence of Western and Soviet films opened up a cultural void where Mexican films fill it up. It shows how soft power works in international studies and how a third world country could conquer another country softly. As the world today, soft power is possible with any country with powerful projection of culture for some reason. Maybe publish a game about sea creatures, for example.